Hello everyone, it's good to be able to join you from Rome and to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about climate change and what that means in the context of migration. Across and within borders, people are on the move. And of course, there are myriad reasons for that. Some people choose to move for work, for love, perhaps of another country, perhaps of another person, or simply because they can. But for a significant number of those on the move, it can't be described as a choice. And rather than calling these people migrants, it might be more accurate to say that these are people who are forcibly displaced. I'd like you to consider the different categories which can lead to forcible displacement, the different circumstances. And that slide summarises these different circumstances, or at least the major ones that we know about. Conflict, armed and political, for example, the dispossession of people in Palestine. Natural disasters such as earthquakes or tsunamis. Ethnic cleansing, just think of the genocide in Rwanda and how many people were displaced as a result of that. And then there's man-made disasters, such as what took place at Chernobyl. And then human trafficking, modern slavery, sadly not something consigned to the 19th century, but something which is alive and well and happening all over the world today. And then there's crop failure, blight, pests that cause people to search food in other places. Criminal activity, such as cartels and gang violence, which cause people to flee. And then, of course, climate change. And all that brings: desertification, sea level rise, deforestation, land degradation. Conflict is usually the first thing that springs to mind when we try to understand what the root causes of migration are. But in this year, when the UK is hosting COP26, it's worth noting that more internal displacement is in fact due to climate-related disasters than to conflict. For people who are wholly dependent on the land and natural resources for their livelihood, climate change is no joke. It can serve as what's known as a threat multiplier, exacerbating existing risks and creating new ones like food and water insecurity, competition over resources, which themselves contribute to conflict and compound displacement. In some cases, climate-driven displacement can undermine regional stability. And that helps us to understand why some countries see climate change as a national security issue rather than an environmental issue. Climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, said the White House in 2015, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources like food and water. So much for these root causes, but what about the numbers involved? They aren't small. Last year, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, estimated that just under 80 million people could be described as forcibly displaced. It's easy to make the assumption that most of those people will aim to settle in another country, but in actual fact, more than half remain within the borders of their own country, trying to forge a life for themselves in another region. And we call these people internally displaced people, or IDPs. Some people call those who are forcibly displaced refugees. But from a legal perspective, these terms are not interchangeable. Strictly speaking, only around 1/4 of those who are forcibly displaced can properly be described as refugees, and an even smaller number as asylum seekers, that is, people who are seeking refugee status or something akin to it. Let me show you why only a small number of forcibly displaced people can properly be described as refugees. This is the definition of a refugee as set out in the 1951 Refugee or Geneva Convention. Just take a moment to read it. Quite apart from actually proving that such a fear is well-founded, just think about those people who are displaced as a result of natural disasters, man-made disasters, crop failure, climate change, or even poverty. None of them fit this definition. And you may think that it doesn't really matter, that these are nothing but labels, but that's just not so. For the wretched people who fall within the narrow category of refugee, there is entitlement to what we call international protection, a regime of rights such as permission to settle in another country, access to healthcare, schools, benefits, eligibility for formal resettlement schemes, such as the UK's scheme to resettle Afghan refugees. For the most, those people who are not classed as refugees, that regime of international protection is beyond their reach. To quote Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, as the forcibly displaced are not covered by the protection regime, they find themselves in a legal void. The reality is that the majority of forcibly displaced people have little or no prospect of being permitted to resettle elsewhere, little or no prospect of accessing rights or benefits, little or no prospect of forging a better life. So it's little wonder, I think, that some of these people try their luck with the asylum system, or indeed opt to live as undocumented migrants. Wouldn't you? Back in 2013, it seemed that more and more people were making desperate attempts to reach Europe in order to have a crack at claiming asylum. And it was that year that was a tipping point for the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy, to which I am seconded. On the 3rd of October that year, 368 people, primarily Eritrean, drowned off the coast of Lampedusa, that tiny Italian island only 100 miles or so from the coast of Tunisia. And it was in the wake of that tragedy that my organisation resolved to divert energy and resources to a project called Mediterranean Hope. It began with just 2 people being sent to Lampedusa to welcome those who, against the odds, had made it there in unfit vessels from North Africa. Working with the beleaguered local community, the team still to this day welcomes, still to this day gathers data, and crucially records the stories of those people who arrive. This image, drawn by my colleague Francesco Piovvichi when he was working on Lampedusa, doesn't just depict the island and the graveyard of boats at the bottom of the sea. The colour draining out of the picture to the ocean floor represents the loss of identity by those who cross, as they become, for some, mere statistics. And it's part of Mediterranean Hope's work to recover some of those identities through sharing the stories of the people who make it, and indeed those who don't. The lottery faced by asylum seekers and the horror of people dying at sea convinced those coordinating Mediterranean Hope that whilst responding directly to emergency situations is important, it's still better to find ways to avert them. The lucrative business of people smuggling survives primarily because there aren't other options available. And so Mediterranean Hope asked itself if it couldn't find a way to address this, a way to open up safe and legal routes which would enable people to come safely to Italy and once here be properly supported to settle and integrate into Italian society. And that is how the Humanitarian Corridors project, which we run, was born. It's a mechanism bringing 1,000 people every 2 years safely and legally to Italy from refugee camps in Lebanon. All of them are assessed as being in need of international protection prior even to departure. They are all vulnerable asylum seekers, and almost all of them will ultimately acquire refugee status. Unaccompanied minors, single people, entire families, sometimes 2 or 3 generations. And they have an experience which is radically different from that of those trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in those unfit boats. For me, it's clear that safe and legal pathways are the way forward. Simply calling asylum seekers illegal or externalizing borders by sending people to other territories to be processed doesn't address the bold fact that displacement is not going to stop anytime soon. How are we as a global community going to enable people who are displaced, for whatever reason, to find a home and improve their lot? The difficulty is that award-winning schemes like the Humanitarian Corridors programme, which are rightly applauded, regrettably don't cover the people that we call climate refugees. They just wouldn't be eligible for such a scheme. At present, the reality is that legal pathways are generally closed to those who have no hope of successfully claiming asylum, because the reasons for which they are displaced are just not covered in the 1951 Convention. Now, you may feel that as an individual, there's little you can do to shift the balance, but I'd like to suggest that this year's UN Climate Change Conference presents us all with an unusual opportunity. The world's attention will be focused on the effects of climate change, not only on the planet itself, but also on how it affects individuals and communities. So I would urge you to engage in, if not start, a national conversation about the people that we refer to as climate refugees and the lack of international protection for those people. I would urge you to lobby the UK government to consider supporting those people, and while they're at it, everyone who is forcibly displaced. Because this is a human rights issue, not simply an environmental issue. Thanks everyone for listening, and good luck with your deliberations on the conference.